Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for coming to today's presentation of the latest annual report from the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture. My name is Andrew Cutting. I'm responsible for communication here in Brussels for the Council of Europe. And with me today, I have the President of the CPT, Dr. Alan Mitchell from the UK, and Hugh Chetwynd, who's the Executive Secretary of the CPT. We will start with a brief presentation from the President about some of the key points of today's report, and then we'll open the floor for questions. We also have a number of people following online. I believe there's the opportunity to ask questions via the live chat option on YouTube. But if that doesn't work, then please don't hesitate to send me a message directly. I believe my contact details were on the invitation, so hopefully you'll have my phone number and my email address, and we will get through as many questions as possible. So on that note, I hand over to Dr. Mitchell.
Andrew, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your interest and your attendance here, either virtually or online today. As Andrew has said, I'm Alan Mitchell. I'm the President of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment and Punishment. I'm joined today by a number of colleagues. My colleague Hugh Chetwynd is the Executive Secretary of the committee. Importantly, I'm also joined by my colleague Dovile, who's the member of the committee elected in respect of Lithuania. Dovile assures me that she came to Brussels for other work reasons, not only to listen to my presentation of the 2024 General Report. And I'm also joined by Julien Atouy and Patrice Weber, my colleagues from the Secretariat. 2024 represents was the 35th year in which the CPT continued its work across member states of the Council of Europe in seeking to strengthen the protections afforded to those persons who are deprived of their liberty by state authorities. The first visit of our committee was to Austria in 1990, and since then we have carried out over 500 visits, with over 480, I think it is, visit reports having been published. The work of the committee is very much focused on the twin pillars of cooperation and confidentiality. Confidentiality is actually one of the strengths of the work of this committee. While most member states of the Council of Europe agree to the publication of our reports, and indeed we have 17 countries that have now signed up to the automatic publication procedure, which is a real strong sign of willingness to cooperate with the committee. There remain a few reports of the committee that are outstanding among the member states. However, the vast majority of our reports are now public. The committee is often described as the eyes and ears of the European Court of Human Rights. As a committee, we are not a judicial body, we are not an investigatory body. Our role is as a preventive monitoring body. We visit prisons, police stations, psychiatric hospitals, where we look at how involuntary patients are being cared for and supported. We visit social care homes, where we have a great interest in those residents who are under guardianship orders, and we visit immigration detention centres. In 2024, we carried out 20 visits of the committee. 8 of those visits were periodic visits, visits that are undertaken on a cyclical basis, while 12 of the visits were ad hoc visits, visits that were required, that were judged to be required in the circumstances by the committee. Increasingly, over the past few years, the committee, in relation to a number of countries, has had to recall previous recommendations made. Cooperation, one of the cornerstones of our work, not only extends to facilitating visits of the committee to places of deprivation of liberty, but also to implementation of the committee's long-standing recommendations in a number of instances. And last year, we had high-level talks at ministerial level with officials and ministers in Albania, in Italy, in Montenegro, the United Kingdom, and in North Macedonia. And indeed, also, we met with the recently appointed Minister of Justice of Poland when he visited the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And these talks by the committee and the ministers are the ideal platform in which to take forward at a political level increased cooperation with member states vis-à-vis the implementation of the committee's various recommendations. This year, the committee published its standard on the informal prisoner hierarchy. In the former Soviet Union, for many years, prisoners were accommodated in large capacity dormitories. Control of prisons was, in fact, ceded to prisoners. And unfortunately, in a number of the post-Soviet states, there remains a system of an informal prisoner hierarchy whereby, in essence, prisoners rather than staff are in control. And all prisoners in such country are allotted to one of three castes: the uppermost caste, the middle caste, and then the lowest caste. And the lowest caste are regarded as untouchables. These prisoners are at greatest risk of inter-prisoner violence. They often have the worst living conditions in any European country, and they are essentially forced, in most respects, to carry out what could be described as very menial tasks for other prisoners. And the important thing here is that prisoners do not have a choice in these countries. Each prisoner is allotted to either the top, the middle, or the lower caste. And if a prisoner is allocated to be in the lowest caste, then during that period of imprisonment and any subsequent periods of imprisonment, there is no possibility for the prisoner to graduate to either the middle caste or to the uppermost caste. And that's why the CPT felt it important in relation to these post-Soviet member states to set out very clearly our expectations, if I can be so bold, that firm action be taken by the prison authorities in those countries to safeguard the rights of all prisoners, including those, and particularly those, who are deemed to be members of the lowest caste. How do they do that? A good example of how you move forward, one looks at Estonia. Estonia tackled the issue of informal prisoner hierarchy head-on, and relatively early when it emerged as an independent state and a member of the Council of Europe. Large capacity dormitories were abolished, staff numbers were increased, and the relationship between staff and prisoners was developed such that there is now a system of dynamic security, relationship security between prisoners and staff. But there is a real need, in the view of the committee, for the member states that have not yet tackled this fully to make good progress. The biggest challenge that the committee has seen in its recent visits is the challenge of prisoner overcrowding. We have seen in a number of countries across Europe that prisons continue to accommodate persons far in excess of their design capacity. Why is this? In many respects, sentences are becoming longer. There's an increasing number of elderly people in prison now, a number of elderly men having been convicted of historical sexual abuse crimes. Life sentences, those sentenced to life imprisonment, are often now serving longer periods in custody than they did 10 or 20 years ago. Prison overcrowding is not only unhealthy for those who are incarcerated, but is also unhealthy for the staff who are required to care for those in custody. Across Europe today, we see many prisoners lying in mattresses on the floor. In some countries, prisoners don't have their own beds. They have to share beds at times. For example, in France at the moment, there are around 4,500 persons in prison custody who are having to sleep on mattresses on the floor. The same is true in respect of prisons in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in Cyprus. Where prison overcrowding exists, it's very unusual to see a situation whereby prisoners do not have to sleep on mattresses on the floor. And these can include some very vulnerable, including some really rather elderly prisoners. How do we solve the issue of prison overcrowding? Concrete action has to be taken to further develop alternatives to prison custody. Imprisonment should be the resolve of last resort. While prisons have a key role in the preparation of incarcerated persons for their reintegration into society, on the whole, prisons are a very unhealthy environment. And as such, member states of the Council of Europe, when they decide to imprison people, they must ensure that their fundamental rights, their rights to be treated with dignity, without fear of inhuman or degrading treatment, must be respected. I hope that's given you a quick overview of the committee's work in 2024, what we see as the key issues remaining, and we welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell. Perhaps if we could start with any questions from the floor, and then we can see if the people following online have any questions. Sigrid. If you could perhaps just introduce yourself and say which organisation you work for.
I see that Sweden is not in the report, but I suppose there's also a problem with overcrowding in prisons there. Could you say something about the evaluation in Sweden, if you know? And also, I was wondering, thanks. Some countries, Belgium, also Sweden, I know, are looking into renting prison spaces abroad. Do you have any view on that, any recommendations for member states of the Council of Europe? Thanks.
Thank you very much. The last time the committee visited Sweden was, and I'm looking at Hugh. It was several years ago, but we've now announced that Sweden will be one of the countries to receive a periodic visit from the committee in 2026. The issue of prisons renting spaces abroad is interesting. for example, the Netherlands previously rented prison spaces.
Belgium and Norway.
Ah, perhaps you could explain. That's why the chair of the committee is accompanied by the executive secretary today.
So good morning. Is it working? Is it working? Okay. The prison, the renting, the history, or rather the experience of when states have rented prisons from other countries has been negative. So, for example, the experience where Belgium rented or used space, a prison in the Netherlands, where there was, in theory, a common language, because there was Flemish to Dutch, and it was, in theory, seen as relatively straightforward. The experience when it was analyzed both academically but also on the ground was that this did not work for a number of reasons. Likewise, when Norway rented a prison in the Netherlands, which closed lots of prisons, again, the experience was negative. The ideal was, oh, we'll send the foreign nationals and all the people who volunteer, because that people will volunteer and they'll go there and it'll all. But in the practice was that they didn't have volunteers, then certain persons were sent that didn't want to be again, then they had problems with contacts with the outside world, then they had problems with how do you reintegrate these people back into the community. So at the end, it was an experiment by both those countries. They did it for, I think it was 4 years, and then it closed and it ended. Now, there'll be a new experiment with Denmark, which is opening a prison in Kosovo. Which will come into operation probably towards the end of this year or early next year. And again, the same issues will be faced, and it'll be seen. So we have tried to, our view is that it is not a positive development. It will not resolve the problem, because what you're doing is you're exporting it, and then you're going to find yourself, you'll have different standards being applied. You'll then have the problems of how do you, which exactly are the standards that should be applied? What are the languages? Can you really just send volunteers? Is it also going to be persons who are going to be, for example, try to be returned to their countries when they finish their sentences? So I think that it's not, it's seen as I'd say it's more a political move to try and look at the issues of a quick resolution to, one, the overcrowding, and one, the issue of foreign nationals. So that is the on that issue. I think just one more issue. I think on the just to come back on the which is linked when you said the overcrowding issue, which is an issue. It is in Sweden. It's happening in many countries, and it's also linked to another phenomenon that's happening at the moment, which is organized crime, which is many countries are finding that they're being faced with challenge to their prison system. And actually overcrowding undermines the whole prison system, because it means that what happens in many of these countries is that prison staff, especially if there aren't enough, they start losing control. You may not have the informal prisoner hierarchy, but you start losing control of the prison or aspects of the prison. People are secure within the prison, but basically the stronger groups of prisoners start running the wings. And then what happens is you're undermining the justice system, because then they run the wings, they start continuing to do their business from inside the prison, and therefore prison starts to fail in its whole purpose, particularly the purpose of assisting persons to reintegrate into the community. So it really is about trying to bring the numbers down in prison, and to ensure that only those who really need to be there, and to ensure that you can run the prisons for the reason they're there, and that more persons are supervised in the community, especially because all the evidence shows that alternatives are much more effective in reducing recidivism. So reoffending rates from persons who don't go to prison are much, much lower. And when you have overcrowding, you see that the reoffending rates go up, because basically prisons are just warehousing people.
I think it's also important to add no member state of the Council of Europe has been able to build their way out of the issue of overcrowded prisons. If a country commissions more prisoner places, those prisoner places will be filled. Overcrowding might temporarily, the level of overcrowding might temporarily reduce, but in each of the member states that we have seen where additional prisoner places have been commissioned, these are very quickly filled and overcrowding resumes. So, as Hugh says, it requires political will, and society has to think hard about what is the purpose of imprisonment. And absolutely, for serious violent offenders who represent a risk to communities, absolutely there is a role, a public safety, community safety issue in incarceration. But many of the persons whom the committee have visited in prisons over the past 35 years are members of the community who are serving relatively short sentences, who will then go back to the communities from which they came. So I think we really need to think long and hard as a society. What is the purpose of imprisonment? What are the positives to society of imprisoning people? And let's not forget that imprisonment affects families. The remand of a person or the conviction and sentencing to a period of imprisonment goes far beyond the individual themselves.
Thank you very much. We have a question online from the Spanish news agency EFE. Again, it's about overcrowding. The report speaks about prison overcrowding. Please, could you specify which countries are the most concerned, and which countries have adopted good practices against overcrowding? And second part of the question, do you have any conclusions following your visit to Catalonia at the end of 2024? And if not, do you know when those will be available?
It's interesting that question comes from Spain, the country that has done a lot to reduce prison overcrowding in Europe has been Spain. And I'll again pass to Hugh to talk about how the efforts of the Spanish authorities have led to significant reduction in prison overcrowding in that country.
Thank you. I think Spain actually is one of the good examples within Europe of a country which had a very high prison population, around 76,000, and over the last 10 years has brought it down by 2020 to 55,000, and has managed to stabilize it. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems, and they have big institutions, but it is one. And what the lesson of that, for example, compared to certain other countries, if we take Italy, whereby they reduced their population, but they did it through an amnesty. In Spain, what they did is they re-looked at their legislation, and they thought, where can we really ensure that only the persons who need to be in prison are put there, and particularly around the issue of drugs and persons being sent to prison for drug-related offences who perhaps needed more treatment in the community than imprisonment. And it has been successful. And that, I think, is the key, is that those countries that are able to look at to really have a lasting change in their prison populations is effectively looking at the criminal legislation. So on Spain. Of course, there are also countries which have not invested in their prison system at all. So they've allowed their prison system to deteriorate, and therefore there is a need at any rate to invest a certain amount to ensure that they can at least keep the persons that they do have in prison in a decent condition. But we see that overcrowding, particularly in the big countries, we mentioned France, Italy, where it is really rising. And even in the Netherlands, which closed, like, I think something like 50 prisons, they are now also faced with an overcrowding problem because they don't have the prison capacity anymore, and they're also looking for newer types of solutions. It's a different type of problem. Another country that it will be interesting to follow, I think, is Romania, where Romania was another country that had a judgment against it, particularly for prisoner overcrowding. They brought their prison population down. They have a long-term strategy to stabilize their population at around 25,000. It was at 31,000. They brought it down to 19. It's around 24, 25 now. And we'll see. And they had, and it's really, that is another example where they looked at the legislation. Again, they reviewed it. They may have to look at it again, but they really did make, looked at the legislation in order to ensure who's in prison and are we only ensuring that the right persons go to prison. Again, it's not perfect, but it's those are two examples at least of countries that are really looking to tackle it. I think that the country that is really facing enormous problems at the moment and is not able either to build prisons quickly or, on the other hand, to review its legislation is France. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the situation in France becoming really dramatic. And of course, we're also seeing, which is also incredibly worrying, increasing attacks by organized gangs against prison officers, and prisons becoming more and more unsafe. So, and this is what happens when you start losing control of the prisons with overpopulation and staff being put under immense pressure.
And just as a follow-up, the committee's report in respect to the visit to Catalonia has been presented to the Spanish authorities, and we look forward to their response, which we expect in around 6 months. In 3 months' time. In 3 months' time. And thereafter, we anticipate that Spain will agree to the publication of the report, as they have done to the publication of all other CPT reports to date.
Thank you. Another question from the floor here.
What reasons do you see for overcrowding? You mentioned longer sentences, but maybe it's also just more crimes or more convictions. Like what reason do you see for that? And the second question is just like Sigrid. So I didn't see Poland in the report, but I know there is a big overcrowding problem. So what comment do you have on that?
Thank you. There are several reasons why prison populations are going up. In many countries, the political direction is for longer sentences as a deterrent to crime. We see that an example would be Greece. In a number of countries, there are also an increasing number of prisoners held on remand. We see at the investigatory stage, prosecutors asking judges to remand people in prison rather than to remand them on bail in the community, and for over concerns that the accused person might commit further offences while in the community prior to their trial taking place. In relation to Poland, yes, there is overcrowding in Poland. The last time the committee visited Poland was in 2020. And again, Poland is one of the countries that will receive a further periodic visit from the committee in 2026. I recalled earlier that in Strasbourg we had the opportunity of meeting with the newly appointed Minister of Justice from Poland and the Deputy Minister. This year, the Council of Europe's Conference of Directors of Prisons and Probation will be held in Krakow in September. That conference is a platform which brings together directors of prisons and probation from across the European region to discuss issues. I know that prison overcrowding is one of the issues that will be discussed at that conference. And I think it's very telling that the Polish authorities offered to host that conference in particular. So I'm sure that we will continue to have positive engagement with Poland, both in the context of the upcoming Conference of Directors of Prisons and Probation, but also in the context of the CPT's periodic visit, which is planned for next year.
Can I just add a small, and that is that I don't know every country, obviously, but in many countries, the studies into crime have shown that the number of crimes are decreasing over the last 30 years. And, okay, you might say it's the reported crimes, but the number of reported crimes are actually decreasing. So crime is going down, or has been as a general trend in many European countries, but prison populations have been going up. So it's not that there is obviously, and it is normal in some ways, but politicians react to particular events that occur, and when you have, and therefore there are often in certain countries, legislation is not always well thought through as to what the consequences are, and so what you may have is a constant tweaking of legislation, which results in longer sentences, results also in what we call net widening. So more and more persons are brought into the criminal justice system. So, and this is particularly, for example, for women. For example, many women who are in prison are there for non-violent crimes. But what happens is they begin by saying, you'll start with a sort of a community sentence, but it's a criminal aspect. For example, with regard to if there had been a theft, and also for supervision perhaps of their children, and then there's another minor crime takes place, and the next thing is they find themselves in prison. And that would be a classic where you'd say that they shouldn't be in prison. Because especially when they have families, so you're destroying the family and you're placing that woman into prison. And what is the benefit for society as well as to that woman? And so there are some in quite a few countries reviewing this whole purpose. And for example, in the UK now, one of the big, and we'll see whether it actually works, but one of the announced policies is actually to try and reduce, if possible, the number of women by at least half, because there's recognition that many women really don't need to be in prison. So I think there has to be, but if there isn't a real review of the actual legislation itself as one part of this process, but it also means that if you're going to have improve the alternatives to detention, you have to invest in that. You have to make sure that if you aren't going to send people to prison, and that you actually provide them the support they need if they stay in the community, whether it be through housing, through jobs, through training.
Do you see a change in the ratio women to men in the last years in prisons?
I know PRI and Olivia's here has, on a global level, absolutely, it's gone flying up, the number of women. Within Europe, generally speaking, women have made up around 4 to 6% of the population of prisons. And in certain countries, yes, it has gone up enormously. One would be Turkey, for example, but the overall population has gone up enormously as well. So it's so there is a slight rise, let's say. I can't, off the top of my head, I don't know what the actual percentage is in the European sphere of numbers. But yes, there is a slight rise, I think.
Thank you. We have another question online. In many cases, CPT recommendations are repeated for many years and the countries do not comply with your recommendations, what is the next step if a country violates the inmates' rights systematically?
Thank you. The CPT has no executive powers. Our power is the power of persuasion. There are instances, I would say too many instances in part, when countries do not give effect to the committee's recommendations. In such circumstances, the committee may have resort to issuing a public statement. A public statement is very much the last throw of the dice, as it where it represents a failure of cooperation with a member state. To date, I think I'm right in saying there have been 11 public statements only published by the committee. In 2024, we made a public statement in relation to the Russian Federation on the issue of non-cooperation with the committee, and also in 2024 we were compelled to make a public statement on Azerbaijan, again in respect of the issue of non-cooperation with the committee's with the facilitation of the committee's visit, and also importantly on the issue of torture by police officers in Azerbaijan. In respect of prison conditions, public statements have been made in previous years in relation to prisons in Bulgaria, to prisons in Greece, and, for example, to prisons in Belgium. So, when a public statement is made by the committee, thereafter that there is a full and frank exchange within the Committee of Ministers in Strasbourg. The representatives of the member states and the state in which the public statement has been made with regard to are required to respond and develop an action plan. The way to avoid public statements and to increase cooperation with the committee is to have that engagement, though, at political level. And that's why I made reference earlier, and the 2024 report sets out the high-level talks that the committee have had. And these high-level talks with ministers are directly in relation to recommendations of the committee that we as a committee feel much more concrete action needs to be taken with respect to.
If I could just add, I think that if you look at where the CPT goes, and how often it goes to certain countries, it's an indication of what we would think are the increasing problems within a country where there is action is not being taken to implement all of our recommendations. So I think that is one way of looking at it. The other issue to be clear is that many of the things the issues that can be done quickly, so taking somebody out of a prison because they need mental health support, they shouldn't be in prison, closing down a particular cell or a poor unit in a psychiatric hospital, those things tend to be done. The things that are much harder is that we're asking is that if you really want to run, whether it be immigration detention, police impunity, investigations into allegation of ill treatment, or prisons, these are long-term decisions. And the problem is that many governments that we find are not always willing to take that step. And that's what we're trying to push, is them to really think through the strategy of what they're trying to do. Not now, but like 5 years. And that requires planning. And I think that is one of the harder challenges of getting our message across. to make those changes. And what we are trying to do is we're working very hard also with our colleagues also in the Council of Europe and in cooperation programs to try and support these countries to say, listen, you cannot just continue with the system that you're doing. And a good example would be Greece, where the prison system, and we've catalogued this very clearly. The prison system is failing, and it has been for a number of years. Then you have to have a clear strategy of how you're going to get out of this over a 5 to 10 year period. And you cannot just say, yes, we're building more prisons, and yes, we're going to do more activities. If you don't have a clear strategy with financing, because that's the problem, then it's clear that system is going to continue to fail.
And let me just recall what I said earlier. While the committee has no executive powers in many respects in relation to places of detention, we are the eyes and ears of the court. The European Court of Human Rights frequently cites the findings of the committee in its judgments against member states.
Thank you. 2 questions from the Italian news agency Answer. The first one is, during the recent high-level meeting, did the CPT talk about overcrowding in Italy? Did it suggest revising laws as part of the solution? And what was the response from the authorities? Several questions in one. And the second question, will the CPT visit the Centre for Migrants used by Italy in Albania?
Thank you for that question. We met recently with the Minister of Justice, Minister Nordio, in Rome, where, of course, we discussed the issue of prison overcrowding. And we also touched on the issue of Italy's proposals, and they have now been effected to accommodate a number of migrants in the facilities in Albania. In respect of whether the CPT will visit any particular facility, our work is such that we announce periodic visits, ad hoc visits that are required in the circumstance, are advised to the respective governments only 1 week often in advance of the visit. But fair to say, in respect of all ongoing developments within the Council of Europe member states as to the placement of persons deprived of their liberty, we very much keep a watchful eye on that.
Perhaps I could just add that, as you may know, we visited the immigration detention centres in Italy last year, and Alan Mitchell was there as part of the group, and that report is highly critical of the way in which persons are kept, of the treatment of those centres, the way they're managed, the way the use of riot police to staff them. And given that the model is to some extent exported to Albania, I think it's quite clear what the committee's stance is without even having been there yet. And I think, as the President said, it is not to be excluded that we will not go there in the near future.
Thank you. There's another question at the back of the room.
Thank you. Brahim Arad, Italian news agency AG. Is just a follow-up on this question. How are you worried about that the Albanian model could become an European model with returns hubs that are being discussed now? Thank you.
It's an area of concern for the committee. We, as the Executive Secretary says, we're following very closely what's happening vis-à-vis the accommodation of migrants in Albania, migrants as are apprehended by the Italian authorities. a number of European countries have been speaking recently about return hubs. If return hubs are to be expanded, it is absolutely essential that the fundamental rights of all persons accommodated therein are fully respected. In recent years, as a committee, we have had an increased focus on migration and the detention of foreign nationals. I can see no let-up in the committee's focus on that area in the years ahead.
Thank you. We have one further question online from the Hungarian outlet HVG. Can I get some information about overcrowding in Hungarian prisons? How many new prisons have been built recently, and has this helped?
Actually, Hungary does have has a larger capacity and has had a very high number of persons detained per 100,000 compared to, let's say, most countries in Western Europe historically. So it actually has it doesn't have a capacity problem as such. I think that what is interesting is that we were in Hungary 2 years ago, and we have just returned again from a follow-up visit where we were looking into the situation in 2 prisons in particular. But it is lesser. In Hungary, the issues were slightly different. In 2023, the report, which is public, obviously, we were particularly concerned at that time about cases of ill treatment and the way that prisoners were being kept and treated in those prisons. But it's not an overcrowding issue.
Thank you. Another question from the floor.
Thanks. Olivia Rope from Penal Reform International. I was just wondering about, has the CPT been looking into the detention of activists in the wave of protests in Turkey and Georgia and other countries? And I was particularly interested to hear if there's any links with, say, the informal hierarchies when these people end up in prison, or overcrowding rates, etc. If there's any findings from recent events, would be great to hear.
Thanks, Olivia. In 2024, the CPT did carry out a visit to Georgia. We returned after the periodic visit to assess the situation in relation to the mass demonstrations that took place. Only 2 weeks ago, Hugh and I were in Turkey. We visited persons who had been arrested recently in the context of the mass public demonstrations, visited them in police facilities in both Istanbul and in Ankara, and also visited some prison facilities in Turkey. The reports in relation to the visit to Turkey will be presented to the committee at its July plenary and thereafter transmitted to the Turkish authorities. The report in relation to Georgia also will be presented to committee in July. It's important to also understand that at the end of these visits, the delegations of the committee met with the national authorities. Most recently in Turkey, we met with both the Minister of Justice and the Deputy Minister of Interior, where we had a very open dialogue. And Turkey and Georgia are countries that ordinarily do publish CPT reports. Georgia, I think, that has published all reports that have been presented to date. Turkey, there are still some reports of the committee that remain unpublished. And as with all member states where there are unpublished reports, at every meeting that we have with the authorities, with the relevant ministers, we push on the issue of publication, because publication of reports equates to transparency, and that transparency serves to further strengthen the protections of those who are deprived of their liberty.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from the floor? This gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. I'm Andrzej Zajec, head of the Liaison Office of the Council of Europe to the European Union. You have mentioned, Mr. President, the report on the informal prisoners hierarchy. While preparing this report, what is your assessment of the level of understanding of the gravity of the problem by the national authorities in the countries concerned? And do you have the feeling that they understand the need to eradicate this phenomenon at this very early stage, because the report has been just published? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have visited recently Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Armenia, and during those visits raised directly at ministerial level the importance of prisons being run by staff being in control rather than prisoners being in control. We have used the example of the progress made by Estonia. Progress was made by Estonia because there was political buy-in. There was a recognition of the problem and commitment to eradicate the problem. The issue of informal prisoner hierarchy has been around since the times of the Gulag in the Soviet Union. Certainly at a political level, we have received commitments. However, it is by visiting and seeing the situation on the ground that we will judge progress. And we really hope to be in a position whereby it is not necessary for the committee to make any public statement in relation to informal prisoner hierarchy within any of the member states of the Council of Europe who formerly were part of the Soviet Union.
Just to add that in the context of this issue with the committee of the last 2 years, we basically visited all the countries concerned. And in parallel to that, there's now the European Court of Human Rights, which has had a judgment on it. And in parallel to that, there is a process undergoing about what kind of fundamental support can be provided to help these countries to do this. And certainly, Latvia, for example, has developed a strategy, but now it's a question of the implementation. Likewise, in Lithuania. The other countries, there have been attempts in the past, which were, for example, in Georgia, where they actually had a very intensive attempt to break the hierarchy, but using brutal methods. And now we find that the reaction to that is then that in some ways the hierarchy has come back into force in that country. So again, as I said before, these things, when you talk about reforming prisons, it cannot be done overnight. It needs to be a proper long-term strategy with of involving the staff, involving the physical environment, involving training, and obviously all the aspects around procedures. And therefore, if that planning doesn't go in, then it's not going to take place. And that's what we're trying to initiate, at least to have that plan in place. And that's the first step, and then to move forward.
Thank you. I can't see any further questions. I perhaps have a quick question to finish off with, just about the CPT's interactions with the European Union, and if there are any ways that you would like to see those strengthened, perhaps, or if everything's going very well.
You want me to do that? Okay. They could certainly be strengthened. Are we involved? What I would say is positive, and that's thanks to our colleagues here, is that I think that when there is a revision of, for example, the returns directive, which is being in terms of the as part of the migration pact, and they've been looking at it, that there is a reach out to us to find out what are our minimum standards. Likewise, the European Union, or the European Commission, when it adopted its recommendation at the end of 2022 on pre-trial procedures and conditions of detention, the recommendation there, it cites very clearly what the CPT approach is, and in moving forward, the DG Just is now consulting with us, as well as others, of course. Would we like to be involved a little bit earlier? Perhaps. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings, particularly, is that there was a judgment by the European Court of Human Rights, which effectively, which has been misread in many ways by many countries in lowering the standards in prisons, when that wasn't at all their intention. And unfortunately, the European Commission's recommendation, they picked up on that. So actually, it's a little bit contradictory within their text. So, in brief, I think we have, and particularly over all the candidate countries, we have very good contacts. We're very much consulted, Chapter 23, Chapter 24, and I think that's right, because I think these are, so we try to explain to me, if these fundamentals of how do you run, how are people treated in psychiatric hospitals, in social care homes, in prisons, how do the police operate? If those fundamental bases of a rule of law, protection of human rights, are not done, after it's very difficult. And I'll give you a very clear example, and that would be if we take a country where we have had a lot of issues over the last 10 years and the President's been involved, and that would be Bulgaria. In all of those areas where we found that the state is not being able to keep people in decent conditions. And therefore, I think that it is essential that the European Union is very much aware of the findings of the CPT, and supports these countries before they come in, and even after they come in, to ensure that across the board the persons are properly held in decent conditions and treated with dignity.
Andrew, let me just mention a very live example. The European Union's Pact to Migration and Asylum, which was adopted in May 2024, includes the provision for independent monitoring at the EU's borders. The European Union are looking to the Fundamental Rights Agency for assistance in developing that framework. All member states, the EU, are looking to the Fundamental Rights Agency as to how best to develop an independent border monitoring framework. The CPT is actively engaged with the agency. To date, independent border monitoring has now been implemented in Croatia. the committee visited Croatia in 2020 were highly critical of the forced pushbacks, the violent pushbacks of persons from Croatia into Bosnia-Herzegovina. However, we had, as a committee, we had good engagement with the Minister of Interior, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister Bosinovic. We met in Zagreb. We also met in Strasbourg, and we believe that definite progress has been made by that country in relation to the development of independent border monitoring, and we hope that such progress will be replicated across all of the EU member states.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for coming here today to present the report. The report will be published on the Council of Europe website any minute now, hopefully. There are also copies in the lobby just as you come in. And you're all very welcome to stay and have a cup of coffee and a croissant and a chat maybe, if you can stick around for a few minutes. And thank you also to the people who followed us online for your attention and your questions.